Director of Finance, 2018-19 budget. Authorization to publish notice of hearing. The proposed 2018-19 district budget will be shared with the board at tonight's meeting. The 2018-19 notice of hearing is provided in the appendix. It is recommended the board approve the publication of the 2018-19 notice of hearing that will set the annual budget hearing for August 27th, 2018. Thank you. You're ready.
Welcome, Susan. It's good to see you tonight.
Good evening, President Logan, Superintendent Thompson, Vice President Rohde, members of the board. I'm sure it does feel like we've been talking budget for quite a few months, and we have. I think I gave my first presentation related to the potential planning for fiscal year 19 back in February, so we've been going on 7 months now. But it's a marathon, not a sprint, as many of our processes are in the district, so we've finally made it where we're pretty close to the finish line, although in 2 months we'll start planning for fiscal year 20, so we'll start the marathon all over again. But tonight it's a look at fiscal year 19. And
Okay. I was going to say I could share.
okay. So let's just look at a few of fiscal year 19 budget highlights. These are items you've heard me say before, but kind of in a recap fashion. Again, our base aid per pupil increased from $4,006 to $4,165 under the new school finance formula. That's an almost 4% increase. There was additional special education funding provided, totaling about $4.6 million budget to budget, which puts the district at around, districts in Kansas at around 83% of excess costs, reminding the board that 92% would be statutory compliance. So we're up from the 70s to 83. We still have a little ways to go. The district also received $4.4 million more in the supplemental general or local option budget state aid, which did reduce our LOB mill levy. And several budgets, including capers, bond and interest, gifts, and grants, are significantly higher in the fiscal year 19 budget, but they do not allow for additional funding for general operational costs. They are specifically targeted to certain spending areas, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so several of these slides that I'm presenting tonight were designed to answer specific questions. So this first slide, which is fiscal year 19 state aid comparison, answers the question, how much additional state aid will we receive in fiscal year 19 compared to actual state aid received in fiscal year 18? So each slide has a little different approach to it. That's the purpose of this slide. And our general state aid, including weightings, increased from $304 million to $315 million in change, or almost $11 million increase in general state aid. Supplemental general, we talked about, we're getting $4.4 million additional supplemental general state aid. Special education, actual to budgeted, is a $6 million increase. In state aid, we were a little light last year because we had some audit adjustments, so it's that $4 million figure plus taking us back up to where we think we're going to be for fiscal year 19. The CAPER state aid we talked about last week, we're getting a significant increase in CAPER state aid because of some back payments into CAPERs, because the employer rate has gone up 1.27%, and then the wage increase impact to CAPERs. So that's about $13.7 million increase to budget, increase in state aid on this slide's focus. Capital outlay state aid, a little over $500,000 there. Bond and interest, almost $3 million, and then there's just a little bit of miscellaneous. For total state aid, actual to budgeted for fiscal year 19, an increase of $38.6 million. So if you're asked the question, how much additional state aid is the district going to receive, the $38.6 million is about is our budgeted number for fiscal year 19. looking at what our legal max new authority will be, so what new funds are available, we are looking at last year's adopted budget, the final legal max calculation, compared to what we're calculating based on the additional base per pupil, on what we think our enrollment will be. So that's how we come up with our estimated budgeted expenditures compared to last year's legal max. We're still sitting at the same number I shared last Monday, which is a little over $18 million between those two funds. So that number did not change in the past week of kind of tweaking the budget through the final steps of our process. That $18 million includes funds that will go to the weighted funds via transfers. So just to kind of show you that every fund, except for virtual, gets a bump. Virtual, we overestimated a little bit last year, so we're trying to come in a little bit more realistic estimate as far as head count. But the rest of the funds are all going up, particularly special education. Taking a quick look at some specific selected funds, capital outlay, we're going to go from and this is budget to budget, so again, a slightly different look at fiscal year 19 compared to fiscal year 18. And I'm doing this purposely a little bit tonight to show when we get questions on why are numbers different, a lot of it depends on, first of all, what question are you trying to answer? So we're trying to show that, okay, if you're asking how much state aid, this is the way what our approach would be. If you're asking how much our budget has increased compared to last year's budget, this is our answer. If you're looking at actuals to budget, that's a different set of numbers. So again, it depends on what you're asking, what our response is, and those numbers, if you put them side by side, look different, but it's all because of how you're, posing the question and what we're looking at as far as apples to apples, or apples to oranges, or apples to peaches, whatever your comparison may be. So we wanted to look a little bit at some of the selected funds, and in this case, we're looking at the final adopted budget for fiscal year 18 compared to the adopted estimated expenditure amount or legal max spending authority in those funds for fiscal year 19. Capital outlay, we are giving ourselves a little bit more spending authority than we had last year. Again, state aid's up, property tax valuations are up, so we have a little bit more availability within this fund, and we wanted to give ourselves just a little bit more room. I think I shared last week, I thought I was maybe just a little bit tight on this fund last year, so I'm going to go in a little bit more aggressively, particularly since we are doing some work related to safety this year. We wanted to make sure we had enough to get the match made and all the work done that we need to get done in this first year of that grant. Nutrition services up just a little bit. That's pretty typical for nutrition services. Professional development is one that's down a little bit, and I think I shared that we were actually getting some Title IV money, which we are transitioning to Title II because of the late notice that we received in receiving those dollars. That's a Safe and Civil Schools grant under ESSA. We're able to, you can go through a process of a needs assessment and determination of how those dollars would be allocated. Because originally we thought we would get about $25,000 under that grant, and then just very late in the process, that increased to $800,000. We're going to transition it to Title II for this year and use it as professional development, which is allowed. But that's why we were able to pull back on the professional development fund, because we had those additional funds federally. Latchkey, again, a little bit more expenditures there. That's pretty normal. We talked about parents as teachers. Budget to budget, it does not look like we're increasing. In fact, that's a budget to budget decrease, but actuals were less than $200,000. So we have staffing in place right now. We would expect to expend most of that budget in fiscal year 19. The special liability, for the most part, it's going to be flat. Virtual, we talked about, and then the capers issue we talked about, and bond and interest, those budgeted figures reflect our bond call scheduled for October. So those are just some highlights of a few selected funds. Does not include every fund that's listed on the notice of hearing. I did not put in textbooks because we don't have any real a plan for a major textbook expenditure next year. So that should just be normal consumable cost being replaced. And then I didn't cover federal funds at all because those can fluctuate from year to year. Okay, so what then this slide tells you is, and this is from our notice of hearing, this is our net expenditures. So our net budget authority, after we account for all the transfers, our fiscal year 19 budget is set for $730, almost $740 million, compared to last year's budget of $682 million. So an increase in our budget of $57 million. The big players in that number include the CAPERS of 11.4, capital outlay of 8.7, bond and interest of $5.7 million. The gifts and grants, $5.3 million. In gifts and grants, that's the mental health pilot, all three components, what we get for our liaisons, what ComCare gets as a pass-through from us for services, and then the pass-through for the Kansas State Department of Health. So it's all three of those components are running through our budget, so we have to push up the budget in order to be able to expend those funds back out. Federal funds are up a little bit, and then the supplemental, which we talked about, the new funding available for general operations, $18 million. The highlighted in green is what's available for operational expenditures. The others are either targeted or they are restricted due to federal statute. Okay. Mill levies, we talked about this, and generally these have, the bottom levy number has not changed. We are still sitting at 53.615, a decrease of 0.118 mills for fiscal year 19. We were able to pull back a little bit on the special liability. We had a meeting last week on that, so we felt we could draw back a little bit there, but we did need to come up a little bit on the LOB because of some last tax calculations, but overall, we're still at the same place, a decrease in the mill of 0.118. That's what we forecasted for you last week. Showing you the historical trends related to the mill levy. You can see, you could almost draw a straight line across this chart. You've got the two increases in 13 and 14 and 15 and 16. That's where we were having equity issues within the formula, where we lost state aid, it was restored, we lost, it was restored. So other than those 2 years, we've been relatively consistent right across the board. Just to give the board some information related to area mill levies, I've put our surrounding school districts just for your information. Obviously, that isn't an apples-to-apples comparison. We look different than our suburban neighbors, but this is just information that's kind of nice to have if you should be asked any questions about it. A reminder of where money was invested. Certainly, we have had several conversations about using the strategic plan as our template, which has worked extremely well. We were explaining that to principals that we did leave quite a few requests go unfulfilled because, again, there's only so many dollars to go around, and the unfulfilled requests typically did not meet one of the themes in the strategic plan, or it didn't fit one of the goals. So if they were good ideas, they were good for kids, but again, we're trying to prioritize our spend related to our plan. So having that structure in order to vet those requests and put the good ideas that maybe we could get to if there's leftover budget authority, or we look at planning for next year, or we decide at some point is a good idea beyond what we need for the plan. We certainly have that available to look at, but again, our focus is trying to get focused dollars in these areas where the board has said these are our priorities. We've talked a little bit about it tonight, that investing in staff certainly was one of our primary budget priorities, and I think we were able to accomplish that in this budget cycle. But certainly we added quite a few FTE in key places where we felt we needed it to align with the goals that we've set. So tonight, notwithstanding any questions, we would recommend that the board establish the 6 p.m. August 27th, 2018 as the public hearing and budget adoption for the 2018-19 fiscal year budget. quick recap before I take questions. Again, our mill levy overall is going to go down 0.118 mills. Increased state aid for the supplemental general fund did provide a little bit of property tax relief. Estimated new funds available in the general fund and supplemental general fund total $18 million. That is based on our current estimates for FTE student counts. The district's overall budget compared to last year's published budget increased over $57 million. The new funding of $18 million, but targeted expenditures in CAPERS, capital outlay, bond and interest, the mental health pilot initiative, and some federal funds that we received. And then the budget that is built around our strategic plan. And I'll take questions.
I have a question because I just want to make sure that our public can realize this, because when you throw these, well, you didn't throw, but when you put these numbers out this way, it becomes confusing to say, you know, how much money did we really get? The bottom line is, on your first slide, you said we got $38,622,383. That's additional money, but that's everything.
Right.
So money that we can actually use for teachers' raises or for ongoing expenses of electricity or whatever that we have expenses on is truly that 18 million, correct?
The $18 million is where you have the ability to move that money where you see fit within the budget. So raises,
Everything else is earmarked.
adding, everything else has a purpose in the budget.
Yeah. And so we've worked really hard as a board to be able to give as much as we possibly could to our staff.
Yes.
And that's where that money came from.
Yes.
And that's also where any fixed costs like utilities comes from.
Certainly fixed costs, there's a component coming from there. We also did quite a bit of shifting from last year's budget to make sure that we could stretch the new money as far as we could related to salaries. We knew that was a huge priority for the board. So we looked at last year's spending and we were able to say, here is what doesn't align. So we're not going to do that for this next year. We're going to move those dollars from this budget line to this budget line to cover a fixed cost or to cover a Bryant or to cover where FT was added. So it wasn't that we just said, I can't make it, so I have to look at that budget and go, here is where the priorities need to go, and then shift dollars to where the board has set those priorities. Right. But the new money we maximized every dollar they gave us.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Stan, did you have a question?
I did, but she answered it.
Oh, okay. Julie?
I think we talked about this last time, but just to repeat again, remind us where we're at. I appreciate the additional monies, appreciate not having to do budget cuts, but remind us again where we're at with base aid per pupil. Compare us, in the
Right.
years back.
2008, 2009 was kind of the peak for base aid per pupil, and at that point the level was it started at $44.92, it decreased to $4,400 even before the end of that year, and then we had been on kind of the downhill slide to $38.52. It's where we bottomed out, then back up to $4,006, now to $41.65.
So we're still not caught back up to...
Not to that level where we were in 8-9, and that's not accounting for inflation.
Thank you.
Mike?
I'd like to make the motion that we establish 6 p.m. August 27th, 2018 as the public hearing and budget adoption for the 2018-19 budget.
Okay, have a motion by Mike. Do I have a second?
I second it.
A second by Ernestine. Motion passes 6-0, so you can publish. We'll have the public hearing at the beginning of our board meeting, the next meeting, and then we will vote on the budget hopefully that same evening, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you very
Very good.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for all your hard work.
Hope you can start sleeping again at night.